So hello, everybody. Welcome to this RightsCon event entitled Driving Corporate Action Towards Responsible and Ethical Artificial Intelligence. And like they say on the plane, please check your boarding ticket and make sure this is your intended destination. I actually thought of that small joke earlier today and thought it's actually appropriate because this topic is not yet a very mainstream destination, so to speak, or a widely discussed or understood topic, which is why we're here today to learn more about the issues of ethical AI, particularly in a corporate context, and how we as various stakeholders in an evolving and increasingly digital world can better understand and thus perhaps help guide positive developments in this area. So I'd like to briefly introduce and thank our speakers for joining us to discuss questions of responsible AI and driving corporate action. We're pleased to have for our discussion today, Lourdes Montenegro. She is the lead for digital sector transformation of the World Benchmarking Alliance. We have Lauren Compier, Managing Director and Head of Shareholder Engagement with Boston Common Asset Management, and Benga Chesson, Executive Director of the Paradigm Initiative. So our participants are all very knowledgeable in this field and bringing different perspectives to bear, which I'm looking forward to leading the conversation, which will be about all in 1 hour. We'll hear from the speakers about their perspectives and concerns and ideas on the topic of ethical AI and corporate action. We'll also have time for questions from the audience. So we do encourage you to engage, and we hope this will become an interactive discussion. So in order to set the stage and provide a context for the issues related to digital inclusion and ethical AI, I'd like first to welcome Lourdes Montenegro to provide us with opening remarks. Thank you, Lourdes.
Thank you, Christine. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, wherever you are in the world. We very much appreciate people who are tuned in to start learning about this conversation. And hopefully at the end of the session, our key takeaway is what you can do to help drive progress and make sure that we are in a world working towards responsible and ethical artificial intelligence, in a world working towards an inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation. So to give a bit of a context, at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we are a global initiative that works towards incentivizing and driving improved corporate performance on the Sustainable Development Goals. And through our global multi-stakeholder consultations, we learned that the digital system and digital technologies are crucial to our sustainable development. They are, in fact, cross-cutting enablers. We view these technologies for the promise that they offer towards solving many human problems, from poverty alleviation to gender equality to infrastructure, and even through partnering with each other to achieve the goals. So these technologies are, in fact, going to be the infrastructure of our lives. They are going to help us achieve our goals and objectives as humanity. But to do that, we need to make sure that these technologies are inclusive. And by inclusive, it means that no one is left behind. Everyone, regardless of their income levels, where they are, their ability, their education, their gender, their ethnicity, everyone from all walks of life is able to access digital technologies, is able to have the skills to use those digital technologies to improve their own existence, are able to trust that the digital technologies are safe, respects their security, respects their privacy, and especially respects the rights of their own children online. And finally, that all of us are also able to participate democratically, openly in the process of innovation, and that this process of innovation respects human rights and as well as is ethical. So that is what we mean by a digital transformation that is inclusive and trustworthy. And only when we have that will we be able to find that digital technologies are really our tools for the improvement of the human condition. And one of the key technologies that is often, at the forefront, at the frontiers of these developments is artificial intelligence. To the layman, artificial intelligence can mean anything from the robots that we see on the movies, or it could be the huge amounts of data that we are emitting through our digital lives that is being processed through algorithms to make predictions, to make recommendations, to shape decisions. So we can understand it in a broad sense as using computer systems to try to emulate human cognition, human decision making, and human processes. It has its goods and bads. It has its benefits, definitely, and we can use it to improve the efficiency of many of our economic processes. We can use it as an extension of ourselves to strengthen our own human capacities. But at the same time, it also has its possible consequences. And we've seen that through algorithms and data used in a way that discriminates, that biases against groups in society that are already traditionally disadvantaged, and even more so disadvantaged with the use of data and algorithms and artificial intelligence. And of course, there are many other potential consequences on our privacy, on security, on our ability to make decisions and have human agency and freedom, on the ability of many countries in the world to develop, pursue industrialization, and employ their own people. So there's definitely big consequences to the widespread adoption of this technology that we are seeing now. So it's definitely a key ingredient of digital inclusion. And that's why we're here, because the core of our work is to assess, to monitor, to track, to encourage the largest tech companies in the world to improve on their digital inclusion performance. And I'm very happy that we're joined today with our friends, with our colleagues who are working with us through the Digital Inclusion Collective Impact Coalition to drive progress on digital inclusion and to improve on responsible AI and ethical AI. So with that, I end and I welcome everyone, and I hope for a very dynamic conversation today from different perspectives, from civil society, from investors, why this topic is important. For us at WBA, the writing is on the wall. We see it in the data itself.
Great. Lourdes, thank you for that overview. I think, Lourdes, you froze for me. I'm not sure if you were finished. But I'm thinking that you're finished, and I'm going to move on and involve our other discussants, Lauren and Benga, to flesh out what some of this data means for various stakeholders. So Lauren, as an investor, I think you're familiar with the WBA's digital inclusion benchmark. And I'd like to know what your top level comments are, or maybe some specifics on the digital inclusion benchmark findings on ethical AI.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine, for the question. And as you pointed out, data is everything to investors. And I think there were two key data points that I think were of concern to us. One was, for example, I think the key metric we've seen is that only 20 out of the 150 companies covered in the benchmark have a public commitment to an ethical or responsible AI policy. And frankly, even those that do have an ethical AI policy, out of the 20, not all explicitly reference human rights. This coupled with the fact that only 15 out of the 150 had basic processes in place to identify, assess, and integrate human rights risks. Those two in combination are a bit alarming. I want to also take a step back and say this lack of sort of robust and comprehensive approach or practice around ethical AI is also coupled with a lack of a sort of robust regulatory environment. So maybe in conclusion, I'll say, why is this a big concern for us? One is that we as investors are actually currently facing potential disclosure requirements around the way in which we conduct our own human rights due diligence. There are laws in place already in Germany and France, and now the EU is considering this. This means that as an investor, there's a big burden for us to really understand not only the regulatory environment, but the complete value chain or chain of custody of AI. Who has control, who has accountability, and therefore liability at each stage in the process. We, as an investor, have been engaging quite a number of years on general digital human rights, but and advocating for human rights due diligence and impact assessment to be along the entire sort of value chain of technology development. What is really important here, though, around ethical AI and the use of AI is that there is also not robust disclosure by companies on the way they use AI to their current and potential customers, how AI and algorithms are used in decision-making and targeted advertising, and how companies in particular are mitigating the risks that Lourdes had highlighted related to bias, discrimination, privacy, censorship, and freedom of expression. So this, as an investor, really concerns us. And, you know, I think we're going to talk in the second question about what we think investors should do. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful. And Benga, as leader of a social enterprise, you also have deep understanding of the tech world and experience in the corporate world. What are your comments on the DIB findings of the WBA?
Thank you, Christine. The findings are not surprising to me, and I'll pick on two of the key findings. The fact that, a vast majority, that's more than 80% of, companies who were measured and checked in the report are still lagging in their responsibility towards digital inclusion is not a surprise to me. I think, one would have expected that looking at what the COVID lockdowns taught us, that schooling, going to work, staying in touch with family, need digital opportunities, need access, that a lot more companies will pay a lot of attention to that. But it appears that we've sort of backslid. Either companies or countries, we're not paying as much attention to digital inclusion. In fact, during the lockdowns, one of the areas of concern for us as an organization is the fact that a lot of the young people that we work with across African countries were not connected during the lockdowns and are still not connected. And it means that they're suffering on two fronts, which means one, while their colleagues were learning online, they were not learning anything. And secondly, as the world continues to prepare for a post-COVID world, we're not there just yet, and there are now new opportunities using digital platforms, and they are not included, and that is a problem. The second finding for me is the fact that 20 out of 150 companies, only 20 are committed to ethical AI principles. Everyone is adopting AI, it's a hot word, it's a hot take, everyone is talking about it, but the people who are driving the process are not committing to principles that will make that ethical. And I think that's very concerning. So we have two things. We have one, a case of exclusion, where people who need access the most are kept out, and another case of secondary exclusion, where ethical principles that could take care of everyone are not being considered, which means that you have people who are suffering from two different layers of exclusion. And I mean, that is in the report. Like I said, I'm not surprised. That's where we are at right now. But the question to ask is, what do we do about it? And I'm more than glad that we're going to have that conversation today on how to make sure that inclusion is a priority, and to make sure that when it comes to AI and all of new technologies, that ethics, trust are the center of every conversation that we have.
Yeah, thank you. So let's talk about what we can do. And we'll come back to Lauren, sort of, representing an investor's point of view. What actions can investors take to ensure responsible and ethical artificial intelligence?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm glad we have similar perspectives on what's lacking. And I think speaks to, the collaborative nature of the KIC and the need to actually collaborate. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things. We know that without robust human rights practices, the ability to achieve any of the SDGs, including full digital inclusion, cannot be achieved, as just been discussed. Therefore, it's important as investors to better understand the landscape of AI, promote better corporate practice on transparency and disclosure of companies' involvement in AI, and frankly, how they're assessing and mitigating the highest risks, and also providing grievance mechanisms when needed. And I know that's a very technical term. But this starts with having an actual ethical or AI responsible policy. Describing the governance involved in implementing its scope, and to describe the results of implementation, including, for example, the use of escalation or sensitive use. It is essential that stakeholder engagement with potentially impacted customers and communities and users are also part of the equation. The companies need to have some sort of robust stakeholder engagement process. Finally, I think as investors, we should be supporting, where we can, robust regulatory oversight of the use of AI and algorithms. Because if we raise up the bar and expectations on within the ecosystem, it's a lot easier for us to then focus on individual corporate practice. So laying the groundwork for robust regulatory oversight globally, I think, is really essential. But I think to the final point, and the reason why we're here today, is the unique role as investors to collaborate to encourage best practice amongst companies, to learn what is, to help develop what is best practice, and then to work together with others in the ecosystem to ensure that best practice is adopted. And that stakeholder impact is a key part of that. And so, that's why we're delighted to be part of this conversation and part of the Collective Impact Coalition that WBA has.
Thank you. And I think we'll talk more about the specifics of that KIC, the Collective Impact Coalition, as we go forward. Benga, in terms of your perspective and the actions that you started to talk about, what do you think are some actions that advocacy groups and organizations such as yours, the Paradigm Initiative, can take to ensure responsible AI that respects people's human rights?
Thank you. So I think first of all is the need to understand, and I say that because as advocates, or activists or people who work in the third sector, there are a lot of things being thrown at you. There are some basic issues. There are some issues that are even beyond the basic and things like that. So there is always a contest for what you seek to understand and engage with. You have to prioritize. You can't prioritize everything across the board, right? And so I think it's important for us to understand the connection between AI, new technologies, and all of the other things that we already know and are working on. So for example, how does AI affect gender dynamics? How does AI affect inclusion of young people in processes? How does AI affect, marginalized and otherwise not connected people? When we understand that and are able to make the connection, then we're able to engage with the issues. Otherwise, to us, I talk a lot about 3 levels of conversation. There's bread, there's broadband, there's blah, blah, blah. Bread is, everybody knows what bread is. Food, you want to eat it. Broadband is, well, internet, I already need it, blah, blah, blah. Those are the high-level things. You just hear blah, 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 and you really don't care about them. And for many people, to be honest, new technologies are still blah, blah, blah. They can't find a connection between all this conversation we're having around artificial intelligence and the things that they are struggling to make happen. So I think the first thing we need to do is to seek to understand, and secondly, to make a connection between AI issues and the issues we so much care about. And I say this because as long as we have conversations about AI and then conversations about human rights in different silos and different buckets, we will make progress, because I will choose human rights if I have to choose. But if there's a connection between the two, then I can understand that while I'm having conversations about artificial intelligence, I'm also at the same time having conversations about the things I care about. And so there's a win-win that I understand. The third thing that I think we're beginning to do already, so Paradigm Initiative released a report earlier in the year about artificial intelligence in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think what we need to do is to document a lot more. So that when we have conversations, when we talk about connections, we can speak from the place of understanding what are the basic things that have been set in place in the countries where we work. We need to document so that we can compare best practices, what has worked in country A, country B, in scenario C, that we can then apply so that we don't fly in the blind. So we need to understand, we need to connect, we need to document, and we need to exchange best practices.
Wow, that was super helpful. I have some guidelines for moving forward to understand, connect, document, and compare. That's exactly a great outline for this collective impact coalition that we're kicking off. Let's talk more with Lourdes about some of these issues and opportunities, having the broad overview from the WBA findings. And then we'll be able to get into some questions, which I hope the audience is thinking of some. You can start to send them in, and hopefully we'll become somewhat interactive. Lourdes, what do you see, and from the research that you guys have done, some opportunities for improvements by tech companies on ethical innovations for AI?
Thanks, Christine. That's really a great question to kick off more of our discussion. The starting point, I think, one that we need to reflect on is that very basic figure that only 20 of the 150 companies that had been assessed in 2021 by the Digital Inclusion Benchmark had any care or commitment or disclosed care or commitment for ethical AI. And why do I say that we start our reflection on that? Because we can talk about more things. We can talk about, for example, we have a question about the value chain or the supply chain, especially in the technology sector. The supply chain is not very clear unless you are a hardware company, but it also exists. We can talk about specific governance models, like how do we do this in practice? What is the right way to actually implement responsible ethical artificial intelligence for a company? Or we can talk about the different regulations and their pros and cons and the different approaches. But we need to go back to the basic issue that fundamentally, the industry is still at a point where it needs to be aware that this is an issue. So it's they seem to not be there yet, because we are seeing only 20 out of 150 companies. So there is a fundamental, a basic opportunity for the companies to start there. Start somewhere. Start by committing, paying attention from the highest levels of management to ethical artificial intelligence. And perhaps from there, you will find that there are, also business possibilities growing out of that actually could strengthen the sustainability of your company's value. But it has to start somewhere. And we need to start from there. So I think that's the basic message. Before we go into the nitty-gritty, we need to start somewhere, and we need that basic commitment. And from there, we can talk about best practices. And we see that there are companies who have different sets of practices from other companies. So for example, what we're seeing is out of the 20 companies who have this kind of commitment, 3 of them actually just follow existing principles. So 3 of the companies just use the European Commission's ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. Other companies have gone through a process where they have decided on the principles that they will commit to. In our conversations with companies, we learned that it's different for different industries. If you are in industrials, you need to focus on safety. If you're in finance or fintech, you focus on fairness. So there are different concerns for different industries, different levels of visibility for what you have control over as well. So companies can do things in a different way. But the important thing is you have to start somewhere, and that's the commitment. So we can prescribe and be really prescriptive and say you need this set of principles, etc. But you know, consensus is far and away, because these are values and people can have different values. But the important thing is to start by recognizing that you can do artificial intelligence in a way that is consistent with values, that is principled. So that's my key message there.
And I've had to switch to a headset. You can hear me now still, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. There's a very loud dump truck going by and backing up backwards and forwards. So it's helpful to know where the companies can start, and that some are well advanced and many are early, if at all, really thinking about this, and they're outward, what to do inwardly and how to reflect that outwardly. How can the various stakeholders, what can we specifically do? I mean, hopefully there are a lot of companies on the call today, but as far as investors and social organizations and governmental organizations, what specifically can we be doing now to get started to make this progress, to drive this corporate action?
I think the most important thing is to build awareness that this is an important issue, to document the consequences. There are some groups who are doing that so that the issues are closer to home, and we as normal human beings in our everyday life understand how it affects us and it affects our children. So we need awareness building, and everyone can do that. Whether you are an investor, you have a role in the awareness building, whether you are in an advocacy organization, even whether you are a company who is quite advanced in this best practices in an ethical AI, you can help build awareness, not only about why you're doing it, but also how you're doing it, and provide the lessons for others in the industry to follow and become the trendsetter in a way. So that's the basic thing that everyone can do. But of course, investors have more, shall we say, they have other channels and of influence through the portfolio that they own, and they can speak to the companies about how they can improve. Advocacy groups can, of course, build awareness, but they can also, you know, provide more understanding about the consequences, more public understanding, and especially around public policy, what kind of regulations would be helpful to drive progress on this issue forward. Those are just for a start, and we can all do that together in a coordinated way. The more we do it in a coordinated way, the more we can really drive concrete action. And so we invite everyone who is listening, if you are interested, please get in touch, join us in the Collective Impact Coalition for Digital Inclusion, which this year and next year is working to drive a very specific measurable progress on ethical AI, which is to ensure that we don't just have 20 out of 150 companies with that commitment by next year, that we have doubled the number, or as one participant even dreamed, that we will have all of them 100% having ethical AI commitments. That would be the ultimate dream.
Yeah, that's great. And you've sort of answered the final question that I had for you, which was specifically how other stakeholders can support and work with benchmarking institutions such as the WBA to ensure responsible and ethical AI. And absolutely, The WBA Kick is one of the ways to get involved. Lauren and I are working on the investor engagement work stream. Benga's on the other stakeholders, and we're all going to be working together on this. And I think we'll also be able to talk a little bit more about this in the next few minutes and with our Q&A. So if we have some questions, Lourdes, I'll start with one for Lauren. And if you, meanwhile, can see any on the chat, which I don't have access to, unfortunately, you could send them to me or you could actually introduce them. But let me open up the conversation a little bit more to some open questions. And Lauren, we've talked about why this is important for investors to proactively engage with companies on ethical AI and where there might be some opportunities. But what would you say working together for the joint learning and setting the expectations specifically between investors and civil society, where do you think we can go with that?
Well, I think I actually wanted to highlight a point that Benga made, that ethical AI is coupled with human rights. We need to make sure that those two are together and that they are a package, that one can't be done without the other. So I think that would be one, this understanding of the integration of AI practices and policy and human rights. So that would be one. Two, I think this idea of joint learning, understanding of really what the full value chain looks like. So as and what we should be looking at in terms of what, not only what is an ethical AI, but the scope of just understanding the landscape of what AI is and related to corporate practice. And so this understanding of that AI is used in all different pieces of the technology process, right? And that that means that ethical considerations need to occur at each of those stages, from pre-development to ongoing, marketing and distribution and use cases, and actually even who you sell it to, right? So the fact is, an ethical AI policy or set of principles doesn't just start or stop with the development of the technology, but really the use and who it's used by. And so I think, giving more visibility on the full value chain would be really important, what the full scope and the full value chain of AI is. And then finally, I think, so we talked about integration of human rights, the full value chain understanding. And then I think it really is important to look at evidence, the evidence-based, and really in terms of joint learning and collaboration. I think it is a lot easier to understand what we're talking about when you're actually looking at specific use cases. And I know there have been some, that have been put out there, including, for example, the work that's been done with coded bias, right, and the illustration of bias in the use of AI and algorithms by Joy's group.
So we've had one question for you, Lauren, about the notion of the value chain. I'm not sure if you could see the chat, but the question is a struggle to understand what the definition of value chain and the difference, if any, between that concept and contract-based concept of supply chain, I guess in the context of this ethical AI discussion.
Well, I think I sort of talked about it already. It's really looking at the sort of the whole value chain of technology development, from the pre-development stage to the way it's used, and that also intersects with contract, right? So it's also understanding who has control of that use of AI. Who and then therefore who has accountability for its use, and who de facto might have the liability for unintended consequences. So I think it's both, and if you bring the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, into play, it is really looking at all stages, all stakeholders, and all relationships, right, associated with the development and use of that AI.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think this is such a new topic for most stakeholders. And we've even had discussions, and we could have that discussion. I think we touched on it a little bit. In fact, maybe we can do it a little bit more right now, but how are we going to define AI? Because you could say it's something very basic from an equation that's been used to make decisions. Is that AI? Or maybe it's not really AI, but it is being used behind the scenes to make decisions. And do people know about that? How is that being monitored, controlled, et cetera? Or very narrow, complex, sophisticated understanding of very advanced cryptic technologies. So do we have a view that this should be a sort of a narrow, advanced look at AI, or a quite broad, how is technology being used behind the scenes to make human-like decisions, as Lourdes said? Benga, how do you look at that? Narrow or wide?
So let me confess, my background is in engineering, electronic and electrical engineering. So when you say artificial intelligence, I'm thinking machine learning and other things, right? But in reality, because my work is grounded in policy now, I know for a fact that not many people will define AI the way that I will define it, or any technical definition. In fact, not many people care about the definition of AI. Their interpretation of it is how the expressions, the various expressions of AI from corporate institutions, from government engagement, how that interacts with their lives is what defines it, right? If I'm going into elections and there are suggestions made to me about where to go and vote based on some big data that has mapped how I voted with the timing of the keys and how it will be available. So I'm advised to go to a polling unit 300 meters from my house because it will be free between 12 and 1 because it's my lunch time. That is my definition of artificial intelligence, right? It is the interpretation of that entire black box that I don't understand that then gives me information. So I don't think there are, we will continue to have, narrow definitions. I'm for broad definitions. And the reason is very simple, because I want to prevent the jargons of engineering, the jargons of policy, play into the definitions. So I'm for as broad as possible, but I think the real definition will be determined by the interaction that people have with the various expressions of AI, which is why I keep saying that at the center of all this, two things are important. In any definition that we give, human rights, human dignity must be centered, such that any interaction I have with artificial intelligence, if I post something on social media and I'm getting suggestions of what the algorithm thinks I want to see, it should not be focused on commerce at the risk of my rights. Because right now, to be honest, everything is focused on commerce over anything else. And the second is in terms of trust. It has to keep trust and rights at the center, regardless of what definition that we use.
I find that really, really helpful. I appreciate that. Lauren, would you agree or take any variations on that view?
No, I think Benga hit it on the head. It's this ability to sort of be human rights centric and rights holder impact focused that I think is essential. I'll bring up one interesting case study we were talking about in another session yesterday, and this was around predictive policing models. Where IBM was selling, was helping IBM develop. IBM was contracted to help the New York NYPD develop this predictive model of where crimes would occur at what times, based on historical data. And this was very, where there are a lot of problems with it. And there was also, I think, some links to even some visual kind of mapping. Ultimately, IBM pulled down the marketing and didn't expand it to other cities. But there was no, as far as we could see, there was no impact assessment on the impact to the communities where these where the predictive model was saying there was going to be crime, which would, and that AI algorithm was then being used to deploy police, right, and resources and allocate resources. So, you know, it's just, and that one was sort of place-based, but can you imagine if that predictive policing model went from geography or place-based to person-based? So there's, you know, this idea of the unintended consequences, I think, of the use of AI both by public and private groups is vastly underestimated and vastly under-assessed. And this is what we need to ensure stops, right? That there is intentionality in the impact assessment of AI interactions with
people. Yeah, that's a very good case in point. I do want to close the loop on IBM just in case we know the answer. I think they are not any longer engaged in that. Is that the case in that policing algorithm? They're not doing that work.
That is the case.
Yeah. Good.
That is the case. They stopped marketing that product to other police.
Yeah. And to wrap up this conversation about how we can understand the definition of AI, whether it's strictly narrow and technical or a broader definition with other aspects, particularly human rights and trust at the center. Lourdes, is that how the WBA digital inclusion benchmark has been measuring companies? Is that what you look at specifically, and when we work to get more companies to improve, we're, you know, hoping they'll improve in these regards?
Definitely, but we need to ensure that we have a broad understanding of human rights, because sometimes the way we understand human rights can be very different depending on cultural context. And in some countries, we think of human rights primarily as political rights. But for many countries and majority of the people in the world, human rights is about the right to live. It's about livelihood. It's about basic survival. So when we talk about human rights and we talk about technology and the impact of technology on human rights, we must not forget the basic issues of how digital transformation could impact livelihoods, could impact the ability of different countries to industrialize, so that we have a more globally inclusive conversation. So I would caveat it that way, but definitely it's not separate. The conversation is not separate from human rights. We just need to view human rights in a broad lens that is truly globally inclusive. That's how we would say talk about it in a way.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question, and perhaps each of you could say a word on this, starting with Lauren. It's a question from Jenny, who really agrees with Lauren's point about stakeholder engagement and wondering about any good practices that you've seen in this regard, which Lourdes might as well, and Benga as well. So, but let's start with Lauren.
I think good stakeholder engagement practices are few and far between. I think much more in use with actual physical supply chains versus AI kind of, you know, value chains. I would say that one of the good practices I've seen, it's not really stakeholder engagement, but it's about training of engineers, like, you know, sort of looking at how from the pre-design phase, the engineers, the very architects of the AI structures have to actually undergo an impact assessment. They actually have to conduct it with some others in their organization. So it's not really a stakeholder engagement practice, but more of an impact assessment process, which I would highlight there.
And Lourdes, I think you might have some perspective on this as well in terms of good practices.
I think what we're seeing from the data is similar to what Lauren has said. There are not yet a lot of very clear good practices on stakeholder engagement, especially in the development of artificial intelligence. And I think that is true not just for artificial intelligence, but for other types of digital technologies. We are seeing that companies are struggling in terms of really getting feedback in the development of their products from external constituencies, from diverse external constituencies, I might add, especially from disabled groups, from the elderly, etc., to truly understand how their products would land to many different kinds of groups in society. So that is reflected as well in artificial intelligence. And what we're seeing, for example, there are 5 companies with an AI oversight board. And if you look at the composition of the oversight board that looks at the issues, it's really a technocratic exercise. So it's more around technical expertise, who has expertise in this area, legal, ethics, etc., human rights, and then they bring that in. But if you are talking about the communities, if you are talking about the grassroots, that is still a bit missing. And one reason why it's missing is because there is still a diversity and inclusion challenge within the digital sector. And we are seeing that from the low numbers of women, for example, in the technical workforce. We see that in the benchmark metrics that we follow on women in the technical workforce, and especially women in research and development. Because if you are to have an inclusive product from the get-go, an ethical and inclusive product, you need to have diverse developers, diverse perspectives from the very beginning. So I think that is still what is missing, and we hope that we can build best practices, and more companies will show up with better practices in that regard.
Okay, and Benga, in terms of good practices and stakeholder engagement, have you seen some that you could share with us to promote these good practices?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. So two examples for me. One is sort of the bottom-up conversation. And I like that, because it then means it's not a policy that is thrown at everyone and saying you have no choice but to accept it. But I've seen some bottom-up conversations. I mean, I've seen researchers or nonprofits, sort of start conversations, and then organically sort of then involves government and the private sector, and then everyone comes around the table and then says, this is what we've done. What do you think about it? And I think this is the place of standards. You've got the EU standard, you've got various ethical AI ethics standards that have been discussed. In fact, some countries have even designed theirs. So I think that's one good example. That there are regional conversations that have led to certain standards, certain minimum requirements to say that there must be inclusion, there must be respect for rights, there must be trust. That's on one hand. On the other hand, and I'm just so address that I've talked about people who have oversight in terms of artificial intelligence. I think that is one example that we need to keep emphasizing, because reality is that because it's a very sexy topic, because it's a very new and eye-popping topic, everyone seems to get almost everyone seems to get excited about it. And then you have that conversation and say, hey, AI, artificial intelligence, and then we get excited and then move on. But we need to ask the questions. And I think that's where governance comes in, where there's an oversight board, where it doesn't even have to be a board, because oversight board seems to have been hijacked by Meta's oversight board. But, there has to be some form of oversight that allows people to ask questions. I always give the example of my own personal experience at a conference in China many years ago, where I came face to face with an AI interactive tool, and it categorized me as aggressive and potentially a criminal and things like that. And the reason was very simple, because all of the testing they had done was 0 Africans. So they had never the system had no idea that, there are people from a country of 200 million people whose voices are loud when they speak. So when I speak, the system is thinking, oh my God, it's aggressive. But why would I be aggressive? I live in a country of 200 million. When I want to speak and be heard, I have to raise my voice. So I think that's where oversight comes in, where people can get a chance to ask questions. And when their questions are not answered, they can report to a particular institution and say, listen, this is what is wrong with the system, and you need to check it and fix it. And even the companies that are implementing can go back and prove that they fix the problem. So oversight is something that we can never overflow.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. We have time for one last question here, and I'm not sure who is best placed to answer it, but if one of you has a view on this question from Ushnish, is there a movement to avoid problematic labor and environmental processes in the AI value chain?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a practical, I'm not going to say the company name, but I do think that out of the 20 that have ethical AI principles or some sort of public commitment, I think the most robust process we've seen is around sensitive use cases. And so that would be facial recognition technology, the use of surveillance, and also sensitive use cases determined by the entity that is ultimately going to have control. So who are they selling it to? Who are they commissioned by? So for example, if it's the military or if it's a surveillance, it's a security government, department. And also if they have an understanding of the ultimate community, say like, used for immigration purposes, say here in the US. I do think that we are seeing in that small group of companies a real robust focus on sensitive use and highest risk. But we need to make that having robust governance and infrastructure and oversight. Things like ethics boards or oversight committees are an important part of that. And Meta, in its defense, has been pretty public about what goes, in front of that oversight board. So we need more of that rather than less of that. So I think that that's one particular area where I would say there has been some progress, because that's also where the highest risk is.
There's also been some progress in human capital management, because that's related to recruitment and hiring, and people are very concerned around fairness around those issues. But that's why we're here for. That's what we are here for as the Collective Impact Coalition on Digital Inclusion. So we hope to proliferate these different movements to avoid these problematic labor and environmental processes in the AI value chain.
Yes, exactly. And on that helpful transitional note, Lourdes, I would like to move into the closing comments. We have a handful of minutes left, and I wanted to make sure each of you has a moment to wrap up any thoughts, make any points, any calls for action. So let me do that first with Lauren.
Join us in the Collaborative Impact Coalition. We need diverse voices and diverse perspective.
Short and sweet, thank you. We do have a little more time. Benga, if you want to say more than one sentence, you're very articulate, so please go ahead. Benga, concluding comments.
Yes, two things I said earlier, I would like to repeat them again. The need for us to make sure that any conversation we're having about artificial intelligence is centered on human rights or human dignity, and that trust is at the center of this. And one final thought, which I think is important, looking at the WA report, it is no surprise that only 20 of 150 companies are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of engaging AI ethics and standards. And the reason for that is very clear. the major driver at the moment of any conversation, of most conversations around artificial intelligence, is commercial. And the problem with commercial drivers is that they look mostly at the bottom line, people who want return on investment and all that. The challenge for us, and this is where our end is to create a straight line between that bottom line of people getting returns on their investment and human dignity. It has to be clear that not focusing on making money, but focusing on rights is good for AI business. Human dignity and trust is good for AI business. But I think it's on us to really establish that. And I wish us luck with doing that, but I'm sure we will make some progress with that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Lourdes, do you want to provide some closing comments and then I'll wrap it all up?
Thanks, Christine. So once again, SDG 17 is our guiding light, our North Star, and that's partnership for the goals. So echoing Lauren, echoing Benga, let's work together, join us in the Collective Impact Coalition for Digital Inclusion. Let's drive progress towards responsible and ethical AI, and hopefully move towards a world where digital sector embraces its responsibility towards an inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lourdes. So we have just about come to the end of our program today discussing driving corporate action towards responsible and ethical artificial intelligence. And I would like to thank everyone who's participated, including the people in the audience, for your interest and engagement in this topic. I think, clearly we all agree it's a fascinating subject, even sexy, as Benga said, eye-popping, but not, it's still sort of blah, blah, blah. It's not well understood. So it is, first of all, important that we learn about the importance of ensuring the responsible and indeed ethical development and use of AI as technology and society move forward, and to do this in a way that ensures digital inclusion and respect for human rights for all. It's not a widely understood topic. It becomes more and more important. And I'm very thankful, as we all are, to the WBA for developing the digital inclusion benchmark and being very forward looking in their ability and willingness to shine a spotlight on this emerging issue. So as you've heard, the WBA is sponsoring the Collective Impact Coalition focusing on the topic. And we have several streams that are rolling out as we speak, including the investor engagement stream that Lauren's firm and my firm are leading as co-investors as part of the broader cross-stakeholder Collective Impact Coalition. So we are really looking forward to working with everybody. We definitely don't have the answers, but we're very happy to raise the questions and make our voices louder in coming months to build awareness and understanding and improvements in this space. Also, I would like to, again, thank you and Lauren, Benga, and Lourdes of the WBA, and again, invite you to get in touch and join us in the WBA Collective Impact Coalition, using the DIB to work on improving ethical AI for all. Thank you.